Hello and welcome to the Christ and Culture webcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. Today I'll be reading an article from youngtextualreform.com called Modern Textual Criticism is Not Properly Scientific. This comes from a series that I wrote called Faith Seeking Understanding, which is an article series attempting to help people understand why someone might believe the TR position is correct. So the best claim I think that the modern critical text advocate can make about the methods and conclusions of modern textual criticism is that it is scientific. You can't argue against the conclusions of modern textual criticism because, well, science. This is one of the only real positive reasons that critical text apologists ever will give for why people should fully embrace the modern critical text. So James White, for example, will offer a brief assertion to the scientific and trustworthy nature of the modern critical text, and then spend the rest of his segment slamming the TR and those who use it. In the mind of the critical text apologist, there shouldn't even be a debate because, well, the science is settled. Yet, according to these very same scholars, the science is far from settled. It is still a work in progress, and anybody who claims otherwise simply isn't up to date with the scholarship, or perhaps is being deceitful, or maybe they're ignorant themselves. This is one of the biggest problems that those in the TR camp have with modern textual criticism, and why many people leave the critical text for either the majority text or the traditional text. Most of the claims that are made by textual scholars cannot be falsified, cannot be replicated, and cannot be tested. Additionally, when a hypothesis is found to be falsifiable in actual science, the hypothesis is modified or discarded. Despite the basic principle of the scientific method, the textual scholars tend to double down on falsified hypotheses or modify their hypothesis with non-falsifiable claims to try and support their failed hypotheses. In short, the modern critical text and its methodology is more religious and dogmatic than it is scientific. The perfect example of this is what is often called Alexandrian priority. Early modern textual critics like Westcott and Hort hypothesized that Codex Vaticanus, Codex B, was the earliest type of manuscript to ever exist within the Christian Church. So, therefore, all later manuscripts evolved from this type through scribal errors, emendations, so on and so forth. Now, this was an interesting theory. However, Dean Bergen and Hermann Hosker and many others dismantled this hypothesis so thoroughly. It is amazing that anybody can still possibly set forth this theory today. In fact, that is why you will usually hear them avoid people like Dean Bergen, Hermann Hosker, and if they do bring up Bergen, it's usually in a dismissive kind of way, and Dean Bergen was dismissed during his time as well. For no good reason, other than, oh, you're just this and that. This seems to be kind of the go-to argument from these modern textual critic types. Yet, when you open an ESV, an NASB, a CSB, or an NIV, they essentially follow Codex Vaticanus in nearly every place that deviates from the TR. You can do this comparison yourself by comparing an NKJV or a KJV to an NASB and then seeing if the NASB takes Vaticanus in the places of deviation. So while someone might say, oh, we've abandoned that theory, look at the actual texts that are being used. See what readings they actually take. See what they believe is represented quite clearly in the readings they choose. So not only did 19th and 20th century textual critics overwhelmingly falsify Hort's hypothesis, the newest method called the CBGM, the coherence-based genealogical method, also suggests that Alexandrian priority is problematic. Most honest scholars, and most of them are not that honest, the really honest textual scholars are the ones that really are not Protestant or evangelical in any sort of way. But most honest textual scholars will admit that later Byzantine readings could very well be original. And there are Byzantine readings in the earliest papyri which tell us that the text type considered to be an evolution from the Alexandrian text was actually, at least in part, contemporaneous with the early Alexandrian texts. So this is really, really, really interesting. While they will admit that their theory has holes, they will never admit that there's enough holes for them to be wrong, essentially. So instead of trying to modify their hypothesis of this Alexandrian priority, this earliest and best line you see in the footnotes of your Bible, instead of trying to modify the hypothesis to account for why there could be these so-called later readings in early papyri and manuscripts, almost every modern Bible prints a text platform that assumes that these manuscripts are earliest and best. Certain individual scholars, maybe, would hold to some hybrid hypothesis of Hort's theory that accepts the occasional non-Alexandrian reading like the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, yet this has no bearing on the actual Bibles that the church reads. And this is a critique I've had forever. When you talk to someone about textual criticism, they fail to find the application of their beliefs. The actual application of the ideas that they're setting forth doesn't really affect them, because according to their own testimony, they read the Greek New Testament. Now, while I highly doubt that, the fact of the matter is, the people that read normal English Bibles are the people that are impacted by these ideas. It's like when someone proposes something like the Green New Deal, which would effectively kill the oil industry, would kill the energy sector, but no, it's for the greater good, and yet the actual impact to the common person would be hugely expensive gas prices, industry shutting down, millions of people losing their jobs. Ideas that sound good in theory oftentimes have cataclysmic impacts to the average person who has no say in the scholarship or the research phase or the actual axiomatic principles behind an idea. And this is the tragedy of modern textual criticism, is that these people pontificating from high towers, from white ivory castles, don't see how their ideas impact the layperson. And honestly, they really don't care. So, the Pericope Adulterae, John 7:53 through 8:11, is a great case study for this phenomenon. In the latest and most respected work on the topic called To Cast the First Stone, written by Tommy Wasserman and Jennifer Knust, the authors suggest that the church was reading the passage at John 7:53 as early as the 4th century, and that there is no other proper place for this passage to belong. And yet you will hear constantly that this is a floating tradition and nobody was reading this until the 8th or 9th century. This is either a blatant lie, or the person making this particular claim is an ignoramus and shouldn't be talking about textual criticism. So this is consistent. This greatest, newest book is consistent with what other Pericope scholars like Chris Keith have been saying for a long time. The same arguments still persist against the Pericope Adulterae, though. Why is that? Because modern textual criticism is not properly scientific. It is speculative, it is religious, it is dogmatic. And that is why Bart Ehrman makes the arguments he does. Oftentimes you'll see, if you listen carefully, he basically points out you're just being a fundamentalist in the way you believe about the modern critical text. And that is where the modern evangelical textual advocate, criticism advocate, disagrees with Bart Ehrman. They agree with him in every single part of his methodology, every single part of the way that they approach textual criticism. The small part in which they disagree is that Bart Ehrman says there is no reason to believe that what you have in your hands is original, where the evangelical textual scholars will look at all the same data using the same methodologies with the same axiomatic foundation and say, well, despite all of this science, we're still going to choose to believe that it's original in whatever way they define original. That is the difference between Bart Ehrman and, James White, for example. There is nothing axiomatically different between the two, although Bart Ehrman is probably much more qualified to make dogmatic statements about the modern critical text than, let's just say, a Mark Ward or a James White. So the same can be said for the longer ending of Mark and many other passages. Bart Ehrman, in his book called Lost Christianities, asserts that there were two contemporaneous versions of Mark circulating in the early church, one with and one without the passage. Despite this scholarship, this top tier, top echelon scholarship, the dogma of the modern critical text still adheres to the supremacy of Vaticanus. In other words, the standing tradition of modern critical text seems to point to Hort's hypothesis existing as a theory and not a hypothesis, meaning that the actual product of the modern critical text assumes that Hort's hypothesis was not falsified. Even if it is the case that the modern scholars do admit that Hort's hypothesis was bad, our modern Bibles are completely agnostic to this opinion. Now, if you have read any of the recent works in textual scholarship, you will see that textual scholars are mostly attempting to interpret data to support Hort's theory of Vaticanus being the supreme manuscript. The methods of modern textual scholarship are simply reinterpreting data with the assumption that the Alexandrian text platform is the earliest, even though many scholars readily admit that earliest does not necessarily equal best, and this is the great disconnect. This is what makes it dogmatic. This is what makes it religious, fundamentally. Because they'll say things like, well, earliest doesn't necessarily mean best. We know that Vaticanus doesn't really relate to, in any meaningful way, to the papyri in the most part. And yet they'll say things like, well, Vaticanus is still earliest and best. So what they've done is they've smuggled this earliest and best argument into the argument that is simply they're just earliest that we have. And I've said this a lot before, but this is something that proves that modern critical scholars and apologists are not interested in being honest to you. When someone says earliest and best, they really just mean earliest from a scientific perspective. And even further, they mean earliest extant. Earliest extant would be the honest scientific way to present our earliest manuscripts. Why do I say that? If I was being completely objective, completely scientific, I would say that, well, all we really know about these so-called earliest and best manuscripts is that they're the earliest we have in our hands. Now, why wouldn't you make that distinction? And further, why would you go even beyond that to say that they're earliest and best, best being a completely non-scientific, subjective, religious assertion? Why would you do that? Because if you were honest about what you had in your hand, you would say that we have extant available to us today, some early manuscripts, some of which were found in trash heaps, some of which were found in non-orthodox places, some of which we're not even sure where they came from, most of which we're not even sure where they came from. We're going to call these earliest and best. Why would you do that? Well, to negate from the reality that there were other manuscripts circulating that we don't have. Now, a truly scientific approach would say there is a lot of data that we don't have. We have an entirely incomplete data set, and so any conclusions that we make on these so-called earliest and best manuscripts would need a qualifier. In this particular region, between these particular time frames, this particular group, who may or may not have been orthodox or heterodox, used these manuscripts, and to what degree we don't know because we don't have a whole lot of them. See, the earliest and best manuscripts make up a very small percentage of our total manuscript corpus. This is yet another thing that a truly scientific method would address. Now, I digress from this point to essentially say that even the claims and conclusions that these people make about their beloved manuscripts are religious and dogmatic in nature. Now, in the case of the CBGM, the goal seems to be to create some sort of hypothetical archetype or hypothetical original of Vaticanus and other contemporaneous texts to find what is called the initial text. The CBGM, practically speaking, doesn't really consider the later Byzantine manuscripts in the same way that Metzger didn't really consider the Byzantine manuscripts didn't consider these Byzantine manuscripts. In other words, the earliest manuscripts we have are supposedly the best manuscripts we have. That's it. And the earliest manuscripts we have are the best manuscripts we have, and the effort doubled down on Hort's hypothesis using modern computer tools and genealogical modeling. They have not changed anything other than now they're trying to use computers to prove what Hort and Metzger were saying for so long. Most of the 5,000 manuscripts you always hear about are, for the most part, not even considered in the CBGM, despite the computer tools suggesting that many readings that exist in later manuscripts could very well be early or original. This should be heavily concerning to you as a Christian. When people use the guise of science to try to prove their dogmatic belief, which is, again, a case study in projection, because that's what they say, exactly what the TR people do, even though we don't, and I've written an article about that. Maybe I'll read it in the upcoming days or weeks. So that being said, the major problem with calling the modern critical methodology scientific is that the methods quite frequently violate any sort of scientific method. Non-falsifiable assertions are added to the mix frequently. Falsified hypotheses are assumed to be true all the time. For example, the pericope adulterae is assumed to be some sort of verbal tradition that recalls an actual event that was added to the text around the 4th century. How can this claim be falsified? How can it be tested? It can't. Yet it is essentially the academic orthodox position on the passage. It could easily be said that the passage was original to John and removed from several manuscripts in the 4th century, which actually has historical support from men like Augustine. So if we're going to be using non-falsifiable claims to prove something scientifically, then let's at least admit we're not being scientific and we're being historical critics. Let's at least say that much. Let's be honest. Now, the underlying principle that causes modern textual scholars to assume passages were added rather than removed finds its basis in the old school of modern textual criticism. The shortest text must be earliest because the text expanded and evolved over time. Yet this is yet another axiom that cannot be falsified and is therefore not scientific. And further, the evangelical textual scholars believe this alongside with Bart Ehrman. There are many principles like this that are not only problematic scientifically, but especially from a Christian perspective. If you hold to the doctrine of inerrancy, for example, then you believe that the original manuscripts were perfect, without error. That means that the text must have devolved by the time we get to the 4th century Alexandrian manuscripts, not evolved past. The grammar didn't get worse, or didn't get better, it gets worse. If our assumption is that the original manuscripts are inerrant, then there has to be a shrinking and there has to be a de-evolution by the time we get to the 4th century, not an expansion. And that's essentially what they're setting forth, but they get it backwards. Why would the shortening be the better text then? If we're assuming that the original Bible is perfect, according to the modern critical axioms, why are we saying that the shorter and the more grammatically challenged text is better than what came before it? Doesn't make sense. It completely flies in the face of Christian orthodoxy. Now, an easy explanation for this de-evolution is that scribes unfamiliar with Greek were copying Greek manuscripts in Alexandria and the surrounding regions. It makes sense that a scribe might make blunders in a language they are not comfortable with. Our modern Greek teachers do it all the time. This supports the hypothesis that the text must have gotten more grammatically troubling in our early Alexandrian manuscripts, not less. Further, from a Christian perspective, taking the shorter, more difficult reading is in conflict with the doctrine of inerrancy because the originals were said to be without error. If we really want to consider historical context, the Alexandrian unseals are said to be created right around the time where Arianism was having its utter field day in the church. Those are two explanations that are not even considered in modern critical axioms. It is dogmatic and it is faith-based. We believe that Vaticanus is earliest and best, and we will die fighting for that belief. This is yet another appeal to the TR that doesn't include fundamentalism, emotionalism, or traditionalism. If the axioms of the modern critical text are hardly scientific and more an exercise of historical criticism, then what basis does one have to claim that the reason to support it are founded upon science? They don't. It may be the case that the modern method is in some way scientific, but it certainly is not the case that the method is good science. If we take on the lens of a scientific perspective and try to offer an alternative explanation to their hypothesis, we can easily paint a picture where the Alexandrian manuscripts were the anomaly, not the archetype. The early Byzantine readings in the papyri and the unseals may point to an early Byzantine text, even from a scientific perspective. The text traveled to Alexandria, where it was poorly copied, and we have evidence of this in the handful of manuscripts that survived due to the desert climate. This hypothesis may be further supported by the reality that many of our papyri were discovered in trash heaps. The texts that we have later evidence for are largely uniform and grammatically better than our early manuscripts. So why would we assume they evolved from poor manuscripts? Again, this claim that the text evolved is not falsifiable. So if the only real reason to adopt the critical text is because it is scientific, the critical text is not standing on any solid scientific ground, it's standing on entirely theoretical grounds. Now, the TR position recognizes that we don't know a lot about the manuscript's transmission history. There is a lot of data missing for the reasons that modern textual apologists give, persecution and so forth. The most important data that could support or falsify any hypothesis regarding the transmission of the text from the 1st to the 4th century is just simply inadequate. It's incomplete. We don't have enough. There is a staggering gap in our manuscript data from this time period. So instead of entertaining the bad science of liberal scholars, those in the TR camp look back to a time when men weren't trying to do science, so to speak. They believed that the manuscripts they had were the manuscripts that God providentially preserved and delivered, and then they made a text from it, and then the church received it. The TR position is not scientific, nor does it claim to be scientific. It is theological, and it trusts that God's word is true. Considering the scientific approach of the critical text has many, many flaws, which compromise the integrity of their method totally, Christians should especially stick with what the scriptures say, not what the scholars say. This is what Christians do in every single other area of their faith and theological practice. So why they abandon ship here is utterly nonsensical. So in short, there is no good reason to say that the modern critical text is properly scientific, and if you were to say that it was scientific, it is not good science by any means. If it were good science, then you would be making the same conclusions as Bart Ehrman, who is properly scientific, though he is also properly historical critical. And wherever you see Bart Ehrman deviating from a purely scientific approach, he's delving into the world of historical criticism, which his evangelical peers love to go in with him. That's just the fact of the matter. So if you're looking for a reason to understand a TR advocate's perspective, look no further than understanding the modern critical textual scholars themselves. When you actually understand what's going on under the hood of modern textual criticism, it is not really difficult to understand why someone might look at their method, look at their faith, look at their practices, and say, well, maybe that isn't it. This has been a reading from an article from my blog, youngtextualisreformed.com. This has been Christ and Culture Webcast with your host, Taylor DeSoto. Thank you for watching. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you next time.